The window exploded inward, not the soft crack of a stray stone or the tap of a branch in wind. This was the full implosion of leaded glass and iron framework, the sound of something large and desperate choosing the wall as a last resort. Leo was 3 pages into a passage on pre-dune ecclesiastical cartography when the noise hit him. His quill dragged a dark line across the parchment. The tome in his other hand dropped, and a century's worth of hand-copied marginalia fanned across the floor. He did not move for a moment. He sat at his desk, blinking behind lenses so thick they magnified the candle flame into something resembling a small sun, and he listened to the silence that followed the crash. The library's night air poured through the broken frame. It smelled of outside, hot stone grit, the faint mineral tang of a desert that began just past the city's eastern wall. Then he heard her breathing. He pushed back his chair and crossed the reading room in short, careful steps. Without his glasses, he would have been useless, just shapes and shadow. With them, he could navigate at close range well enough, provided he got close. He dropped to his knees a meter from the shape on the floor, bent his neck, and brought his face within a handspan of the damage. She was enormous. That registered first, before the blood, before the brass, before anything else. She lay half on her side with one arm outstretched, and that arm, the left one, was wrong. The skin from the elbow down had the color and texture of river clay left in summer heat. Not pale, not bruised, dry, flaking at the edges. A fine, pale powder drifted from the cracks in her forearm and settled on the polished wood of the reading room floor. Leo watched a thin stream of it pour from just below her wrist and thought with the detached clarity of a man who had read too many accounts of such things. Desert curse. He pushed his glasses up with one finger and leaned closer. The brass breastplate told him something. The vanguard ran patrols into the deep desert, the zones that did not appear on city maps because the council preferred to pretend those zones did not exist. They fought the things that lived where sand went bad, wraiths, sinkholes of corrupted magic, creatures that were not quite physical in the way a man or an orc was physical. The vanguard lost people to those things regularly. It was considered, in administrative circles, an acceptable rate of attrition. The soldiers who came back tended not to discuss what they had seen. This one had not come back cleanly. Her right hand was pressed flat against the floor. She was trying to push herself upright, and the effort was costing her. The muscles in her forearms stood rigid under green skin, and her jaw was locked with the particular tension of someone who had decided they were not going to make a sound regardless of what it took. Leo noted that she was roughly twice his height and, in structural terms, approximately 4 times his width at the shoulder. He noted that the sand still pouring from her arm was spreading beneath her into a pale halo on the dark wood. He noted that she had not yet acknowledged him, which suggested either that she had not seen him or that she had decided he was not a current priority. Both were plausible. He reached out and touched the crumbling skin of her forearm. He did it the way he touched old parchment, lightly, precisely, with the fingertips rather than the palm. The surface scraped faintly against his skin. It was dry in the way stone is dry, not flesh at all. The disintegration had progressed perhaps 1/3 of the way up her forearm, and the border where living skin met the curse-eaten skin was slightly raised, slightly warm. He recognized the pattern from a treatise he had translated 6 years ago, a pre-imperial document on wraith infections in the garrison towns. The text had been clinical and brief. The author had noted the progression with the same tone one used to describe weather. She noticed him then. Her head turned. Her eyes were dark green, blood-threaded at the corners, and fixed on his face with the focused attention of someone who had learned very early that attention was survival. She did not pull away from his hand. She did not reach for the short blade at her hip, though he saw her fingers shift fractionally in that direction before they stopped. Her breathing slowed, just slightly. The sand kept falling. Leo sat back on his heels, looked at the ruined arm, looked at the brass plate on her chest, looked at the spreading pale stain on the floor beneath her. He thought about the treatise. He thought about the sunken oasis, which appeared in exactly one document in this entire library, a stolen military survey he had been quietly translating for his own interest, purely because the cartography was unusual. He thought about the progression rate the treatise had described and how many days that gave her, and the number was not comfortable. He stood up, took off his glasses, polished them on his sleeve with the automatic efficiency of a man who had done it 10,000 times, and put them back on. "Stay there," he said, which was perhaps not the most useful instruction given that she was barely holding herself off the floor, but it was what came out. He turned back toward his desk and began pulling drawers open. Canvas satchel, glass canteens, medical cloth. The rolled military survey he had been using as a bookmark. His hands moved without panic, which surprised him a little. He supposed that when you spent enough time with documents about catastrophes, the arrival of an actual one felt somewhat familiar. Behind him, the sand continued its quiet, relentless pour onto the wood. The reading room was still outside. The city slept and knew nothing about any of this. He came back with the satchel and dropped to his knees beside her again. She had not moved far. She had managed to shift her weight off her bad arm and prop herself against the base of the reading shelf, knocking 2 volumes to the floor in the process. She held herself upright through the particular stubbornness of someone who had decided that lying down was a kind of surrender. Her good hand rested on her knee. The bad arm she held slightly away from her body, as though it already belonged to something else. Leo set the satchel down and opened it. He took out the medical cloth and the small stoppered bottle of salt solution he kept for cleaning old ink from parchment. It was sterile, at least, which was more than could be said for river water. He uncorked it and dampened a strip of cloth. Then he leaned in close to the border where her living skin met the cursed skin and examined it with the focused attention he usually reserved for damaged manuscripts. The line was uneven. It moved in a slow branching pattern up toward her elbow, following something, a vein perhaps, or the path of whatever the wraith had pushed into her when it made contact. The raised ridge at the border was warm under his fingertips, almost feverish, but the dead side was room temperature. He pressed lightly along the edge with 2 fingers, mapping the progression, and she did not flinch. She watched him work with an expression he could not fully read at this distance, which was to say he had brought his face close enough to nearly touch her arm, and she still had not pulled away. He reached for her wrist to turn the arm and get a look at the underside. His hand wrapped perhaps halfway around. She let him do it, and he moved carefully, supporting the weight of the arm the way you'd handle a water-damaged binding. No sudden pressure, no jerks. That was when she grabbed him. Her good hand closed around his wrist. Not hard enough to crack bone, but hard enough to stop all motion entirely. He went still. She brought her face close to his, and he could see now that her jaw was trembling with something that was not anger, and her eyes had that specific glassiness of someone running a fever in a cold room. Her voice came out rough and low, stripped of everything that was not essential. "If I turn to dust, scholar," she said, "scatter me in the wind." He did not pull away. He did not look at her hand on his wrist. He looked at her face for a moment, then looked back at the arm. "That's a reasonable request," he said. "But I'd prefer not to need to honor it." He waited until her grip loosened, then turned her arm gently and examined the underside. The curse had progressed further there, almost to the inner elbow. He had maybe 4 days, if the treatise had been accurate, possibly 3, given her size. More mass meant more surface for the infection to consume once it found the chest. He sat back and looked at the stolen survey roll sticking out of his satchel, the sunken oasis. One reference in all of recorded scholarship, buried in a military document that had been officially destroyed 40 years ago and unofficially preserved by a minor archivist who liked unusual cartography. The document described the oasis as real, as functional, as accessible via a route through the Dune Sea that the military had used twice before deciding the cost in soldiers was too high. It also described the water as curative for wraith-based infections, which was the detail that had made Leo flag the passage and write a small question mark in the margin, wondering what exactly the writer had witnessed. He pulled the scroll out and unrolled a section. "Can you walk?" he said. She looked at the scroll, then at him. "I walked through your window," she said. "I can walk." He accepted this as data. He began to pack the satchel methodically, canteens, cloth, the compass from his desk drawer, a tinderbox, the small leather pouch of flare powder he used for lighting dark archive rooms. Then the scroll rolled carefully and slipped along the inside edge. She watched him pack. He could feel it. She had the watchfulness of someone who had spent years reading intent from posture alone, and he suspected she was currently deciding whether he was a threat, a fool, or something she did not yet have a category for. He kept his movements plain and deliberate, no sudden reaches, no fumbling. Just the steady, quiet efficiency of a man who had spent his career handling things that could not be replaced. "There is a place," he said, not looking up from the buckle of the satchel. "It's a long walk. The route goes through the Dune Sea." He paused. "The document that describes it says the water neutralizes wraith infection. I have no way to verify that claim directly, but the author was a military surveyor, not a poet, so I'm inclined to trust the observation." He looked at her then. "I know where it is. You can cover ground I cannot." She was quiet for a moment. The sand made its soft sound against the floor. "You are proposing," she said slowly, as if testing the weight of it, "that a blind scholar leads a vanguard through the Dune Sea." He considered correcting the word blind and decided against it. "Yes," he said. She looked at the ruined arm. She looked at the window she had come through. Then she put her good hand on the shelf behind her and stood, and the room seemed to shrink by half. Leo picked up his satchel and his walking stick and led the way to the door. They left through the service entrance at the building's north end. Leo had used that door 100 times after midnight, slipping out to cross the courtyard to the records annex when the main library locked at dusk. The guard who was supposed to watch it had stopped watching it approximately 3 years ago, a fact Leo had noted and quietly filed away with the same instinct that made him annotate maps. Useful information cost nothing to carry. He pushed the bar down with his forearm, eased the door open, and checked the courtyard. Empty. The lamps along the arcade burned low, the oil nearly spent. Somewhere in the city a dog moved through an alley, nails clicking on stone, and then nothing. Leo stepped out and held the door. Kaylin had to turn sideways to fit through the frame. She did it without comment, without slowing, with the practiced economy of someone who had spent a lifetime navigating spaces built for smaller bodies. The brass breastplate scraped the doorframe on the way through, and she shifted her shoulder, absorbed the contact, kept moving. Outside, she straightened to her full height, and the courtyard suddenly felt like a different place entirely. Leo adjusted his grip on the walking stick and set off toward the eastern arcade. She caught up in 2 strides and stayed half a pace behind him. He could hear the soft pour of sand from her arm with each step. A trail, he thought. They would leave a trail as far as the city gate. He moved faster. The satchel pulled at his shoulder. He had packed it with the careful ruthlessness of a man who understood that every extra weight had a cost he would personally pay in exhaustion, but it was still heavy enough to drag him slightly sideways with each step. Medical cloth, canteens, the tinderbox, the flare pouch, the compass, the survey scroll. He had taken nothing that did not serve a direct function. He had left his second pair of glasses on the desk, which he was already regretting. Behind him, Kaelin made a short sound, not quite a word. He looked back. She had reached out with her good arm and lifted the satchel cleanly off his shoulder. He opened his mouth, and she looked at him with an expression that closed the argument before it started. She slung the strap across her own chest, over the brass plate, and adjusted it with one hand. The bag that had been pulling him sideways sat against her ribs like a small parcel. She did not say anything. He turned back around and kept walking. They crossed the courtyard, passed under the arcade, and moved into the narrow street that ran along the library's east wall. The city's night sounds settled around them, distant water in a pipe, wind moving through a covered market 2 streets over. Nobody abroad at this hour except them and the dog, which Leo could now see nosing at something near a drainpipe. It watched them pass with the mild, professional suspicion of a dog doing its job. The eastern gate was the smallest of the 4. It served the quarry road during the day, which meant the mechanism was old and direct, a single iron bar and a hand wheel for the counterweight. The night warden was a man named Ost, who Leo knew by face, and who more usefully knew Leo by face, knew him as the archivist who sometimes crossed to the quarry to measure old inscriptions in the rock faces, and who therefore had plausible reason to be out in the pre-dawn hours. What Ost made of the armored orc standing behind him, Leo could not fully see, because he was watching the man's hands and not his face, and his hands did not move toward the bell cord. Surveying, Leo said, which was both a lie and not entirely one. Ost looked at Kaelin. Kaelin looked at Ost. The guard turned back to the wheel. The bar lifted. The gate swung inward on hinges that needed oil, and beyond it the quarry road ran straight for half a kilometer before the ground changed color and the desert began. Leo walked through first. Kaelin followed. He did not hear the gate close behind them. He did not look back to check. The road ran firm under his boots for the first stretch, packed dirt, wheel-rutted, familiar. He had walked it before in daylight for actual surveying work. At night it looked different through his lenses. Flatter, the ruts harder to judge. But the walking stick found them before his feet did, and he adjusted his stride accordingly. The air was warmer out here than in the courtyard. The city wall behind them blocked the wind off the desert, but once they cleared the road's end, that would stop. He unrolled a short section of the survey scroll as he walked, holding it close and tilting it toward the sky for the starlight. The route was not complicated in principle, southeast by the stars for the first 2 days. Then a bearing correction when they hit the dry basin, the document called the first shelf. After that, the dune sea proper began, and the map became sparse. The military surveyor had marked 3 landmarks, and the phrase, "do not travel midday," with the flat precision of someone who had learned the rule at cost. The road ended. The packed dirt softened into loose grit, and then the first real sand dune rose in front of them, pale in the starlight, and Leo's boots sank to the ankle on the first step. He pulled his foot free, adjusted his weight to the walking stick, and took a second step. The sand shifted, found its angle of rest, and held just enough to walk on if he moved steadily and did not stop. He had read about this. Reading about it and doing it were separated by a distance he was only now beginning to measure. Kaelin moved onto the sand beside him without slowing. Her weight distributed across a stride twice the length of his, and she crossed the first slope cleanly, reaching the crest while he was still working up the face. She stopped at the top and waited, not turning around, just standing with her good arm at her side and her bad arm slightly raised, looking out at what lay ahead. Leo reached the crest and stood beside her. The dune sea spread in every direction, pale, enormous, moving slightly in the pre-dawn wind. A vast and patient emptiness that had swallowed the military survey teams and the people they were looking for and kept both without comment. Kalen said nothing. He could hear her breathing, still slightly uneven from the effort of the night. The sand from her arm fell in a thin line, and the wind took it before it hit the ground. He checked the compass, adjusted the bearing, pointed southeast with the walking stick. "That way," he said. She stepped off the crest and led them down into the dark. The sun came up like a punishment. It did not arrive gradually the way it did in the city, softened by rooftops and the haze off the river. Out here it cleared the horizon and immediately meant business. A flat white light that hit the sand and bounced back up, so that the heat came from below as well as above. Leo felt it first on the back of his neck, then on his hands, then through the soles of his boots as the surface sand began to warm. By mid-morning he had sweated through his shirt and the salt was already drying stiff at the collar. He walked with the stick in his right hand and the compass in his left, checking the bearing every 100 paces. The compass was a small brass instrument, old, with a crack in the crystal cover that he had repaired twice with hide glue. It worked. He trusted it the way he trusted his glasses. Not with affection, but with the practical dependency of someone who understood exactly what he could not do without it. The dunes ran in long, parallel ridges, oriented roughly northeast to southwest, which meant their route cut across them at an angle. Every ridge was a climb and a descent, and the descents were worse than the climbs because the sand on the lee side was loose and deep and had no interest in supporting weight. Leo developed a technique, walking stick planted sideways across the slope, body angled short steps. It was slow. It was grinding. By the third ridge, his thighs had begun a quiet, sustained complaint that he suspected would grow louder before it stopped. Kalen matched her pace to his without being asked. He noticed this around the second ridge and said nothing about it. She walked slightly ahead and to his left, which put her between him and the prevailing wind, which cut the blown grit that would otherwise have hit his lenses directly. He did not know if she had positioned herself there deliberately, he thought, on balance that she probably had. Vanguard troops were trained for desert operations. She would know how grit traveled in wind, how it worked into joints and eyes and mechanisms. She would know it the way he knew the shelf order in the restricted archive, automatically without thinking about it, the way knowledge becomes posture. She was carrying his satchel and her own pack, and the weight of the brass plate, and she climbed each ridge at a measured pace that did not vary. Her bad arm she held slightly away from her body. The sand fell from it in a thin, continuous thread that the wind erased immediately. He tracked the progression when he could get close enough to look. The border had moved perhaps 2 finger widths up her forearm since the library. 3 days, he told himself. Maybe 3.5 if her constitution held. Orc physiology was more resistant to most things than human physiology. He was counting on that. He was also counting on the map which he stopped to consult at the top of each 4th ridge. Kneeling and spreading the relevant section across his knee, bringing his face close enough to read the surveyor's cramped notation. The route held, the bearing held. The first landmark, a formation of black basalt, the document called the Split Tooth, was marked as a 1.5 days out at military march pace. He was not moving at military march pace. He revised the estimate to 2 days and kept that revision to himself. Around midday, when the heat had become a physical object pressing down from directly above, Kalen stopped. He walked 2 more paces before he realized it and turned. She had crouched at the top of a ridge and was looking south. He walked back up and looked in the same direction. The dunes rolled away into a shimmer that made distance impossible to judge. He could not see what she was seeing. "What?" he said. "Nothing," she said, after a pause that was slightly too long. She stood and kept walking. He followed and did not ask again. Vanguard troops did not say nothing when they meant nothing. They said nothing when they meant something they had not finished deciding about yet. He filed it. The afternoon moved the way time moves when each minute has a physical cost. He counted his steps in sets of 100, which gave his mind something to do that was not cataloging discomfort. His boots, which were good leather and had served him well on courtyard stone and archive tile, were not designed for sand. The fine grit worked in through the lacing within the first hour, and by early afternoon he could feel the beginning of a blister forming on his left heel, not painful yet, but present, announcing itself. He said nothing about this either. At the point where the light had begun its long westward lean, and the shadows of the dunes stretched in the other direction, Kalen stopped again. This time she turned and looked at him directly, and her expression had the particular quality of someone who has watched a situation develop to the edge of their tolerance. She set the packs down on the crest of the ridge. She reached into his satchel, not asking, simply reaching, and pulled out the medical cloth and one of the canteens. She moved the canteen to her bad hand, holding it in fingers that had still not turned, and crouched in front of him. He understood before she spoke. "Sit," she said. He sat on the sand. She uncorked the canteen, dampened a strip of cloth, and reached for his left boot. "I can manage," he said. She looked at him with an expression that assigned precise and limited value to that statement. She unlaced the boot, eased it off with a steadiness that suggested she had done field medicine before, and examined the heel. The blister was the size of a copper coin and had not yet broken. She cleaned around it, cut a small square of padding from the cloth with the knife at her belt, and placed it over the site with her good hand, pressing lightly to seat it. Then she relaced the boot, pulled it snug at the ankle, and tied it. She did all of this without comment. She did not look at his face while she worked. He watched her hands, one steady and capable, one held at an angle to keep the bad fingers from dragging in the sand, and thought about the treatise again. The author had written about infected soldiers, had written about how fast it moved, had not written about what it felt like to watch it happen to someone across 3 days of open desert. She handed him the canteen when she was done. He drank and passed it back. She drank, recorked it, and put it in the satchel. Then she picked up the packs and stood, and the moment closed around itself like it had never opened. They walked until the light failed. Leo drove the walking stick into the sand at the crest of a ridge and called a halt, not because he wanted to stop, but because the compass was no longer readable in the dark, and walking blind across sand at night had a specific category of risk he was not prepared to absorb. He sat down heavily. The ridge held the day's warmth in its surface layer, and he pressed his palms flat against it and let the heat move into his fingers. Kalen stood for a moment looking back the way they had come. Then she set down the packs and began gathering scrub. He heard them before he saw them. A sound like someone dragging a handful of gravel across a ceramic bowl, fine, high, and wrong. It came from beneath the sand, which was the part that took a moment to process. Leo had been walking with his eyes on the compass and his mind on the bearing correction they would need to make at the first shelf, and the sound made him stop and tilt his head and recalibrate what he was paying attention to. Kaelin had already stopped. She stood with her weight shifted forward and her good hand open at her side, the stance of someone who had dropped into readiness without deciding to. She was looking at the sand between two dune crests, a flat depression maybe 20 paces across. The surface of it was moving. Not the slow drift of wind-pushed grains, something with direction. Leo took 2 steps back and reached into the satchel. The flare pouch was at the top, where he had packed it deliberately. Small leather tied with a double knot he could open by feel. He worked the knot loose without looking down and held the pouch in his cupped palm, folding his fingers around it. His mouth had gone dry. He had used flare powder twice before, both times in dark archive rooms to get a clean look at ceiling inscriptions. A pinch dropped onto a sparked tinderbox gave roughly 4 seconds of magnesium bright light. He had 6 pinches left. The pouch was not heavy. The sand in the depression cracked open in 7 places at once. They came up fast, translucent bodies the size of a man's fist, legs like drawn glass, catching the morning light and throwing it in every direction. The sound they made on emergence was exactly what he had heard, the crack and scrape of crystalline chitin against packed sand. They moved in the scattered, overlapping pattern of a swarm without coordination, each one tracking independently. And there were more of them than he could count at this distance through his lenses. Kaelin's shield was already off her back. She had unslung it in the same motion she used to shift her weight, smooth and automatic, the way breathing was automatic. She held it in her good arm, slightly angled, watching the swarm spread across the depression. The wind picked up. Leo felt it first as a push against his right side, then as a problem. The flare powder needed air to carry. Thrown upward into still air, it would disperse in a clean radius directly above the swarm. Thrown into a crosswind, it would shear sideways and disperse over empty sand. He looked at the dune to his left, then to his right, reading the slope angles. The wind was coming off the western ridge, moving east-northeast. He needed to be on the windward side of the swarm, not where he was standing. He moved left at a jog. Kaelin tracked him with her peripheral vision and shifted her position accordingly, keeping herself between him and the leading edge of the swarm without breaking her watch on it. 2 of the spiders had already reached the far side of the depression and were climbing the sand toward them. Their legs left scratched trails in the surface, thin parallel lines like something scoring glass. Leo found his angle, upwind of the swarm's center, the western ridge at his back. The wind pushed at his front, which meant anything he threw up would carry east, directly over the depression. He opened his palm, checked the volume of powder remaining in the pouch, and took a pinch between his thumb and 2 fingers. His hand was steady. He had not expected it to be, but it was. He threw the powder straight up. It caught the wind immediately, spreading in a flat sheet that moved east across the depression. And Leo's other hand was already on the tinderbox. He sparked it once, the flint catching on the second strike, and held the small flame up into the dispersing cloud. The powder ignited in a flat crack of white light, not fire, just light, instantaneous and total, the kind that hit the retina and stayed there for several seconds whether you wanted it to or not. Leo shut his eyes. He heard the swarm react. The crystalline legs stopped their scraping rhythm, and the sound changed to something higher, distressed, the aggregate noise of many small things losing coordination at once. Glass spiders, hunted by refraction, their translucent bodies both gathered and directed light, which was their advantage in a desert that ran bright all day. Overwhelming that system with sudden excess was the obvious counter, which Leo had reasoned out from 3 sentences in a desert fauna appendix he had translated 4 years ago and retained because the biology was unusual. He opened his eyes. Kaelin was already moving. She crossed the depression in 4 strides, shield arm driving forward, and hit the nearest cluster of spiders with the flat iron face of the shield. The sound was remarkable, the hard, clean pop of brittle material under sudden force, like a ceramics shelf in an earthquake. She swept low, took out 6 in one pass, pivoted, and drove the shield edge down into a cluster that was still attempting to regroup. They shattered on contact. The fragments caught the light and threw it in all directions. She moved through the swarm with the unhurried precision of someone clearing an obstacle rather than fighting an enemy. No wasted motion. The shield did the work, and her body directed it, and the pattern she walked through the depression left clean sand where the spiders had been. 2 that had regrouped at the edge of her arc she tracked with peripheral vision and redirected toward with a short angled step, taking them on the backswing. The last one she caught under the shield rim and pressed flat. Silence. Leo lowered the tinderbox. His thumb was red from the flint, but not cut. He counted the remaining powder in the pouch, 5 pinches left, plus the dregs. He retied the knot and put it back at the top of the satchel. Around them, the depression was scattered with fragments that caught the sun and threw small, bright points across the sand in every direction. It looked, from where he stood, like someone had dropped a chandelier. Kaelin walked back across the depression to him. She was breathing slightly harder than before, which was the only indication the exertion had cost anything. She looked at the pouch as he tucked it away, then looked at his face. That was the light trick, she said. It was not quite a question. Yes, he said. She considered this for a moment, looking back at the field of fragments. How many times can you do it? He thought of the 5 remaining pinches. He thought of 3 more days of open desert and what the military survey had listed in its fauna appendix. Enough times, he said, which was not an answer but was the best one he had. She picked up the packs and they moved on. He matched his breathing to his steps and did not look at his hands, which had developed a faint tremor that he attributed to the heat and the exertion of the jog across the sand, and nothing else. The morning was still early. The sun had not yet reached its full height. The first shelf was still ahead, and beyond it the deep desert, and beyond that whatever the survey had not thought worth recording. He adjusted the compass bearing and kept walking. The scrub burned low and mean. It was the only kind of fuel the desert offered. Thin, dry stalks no thicker than a finger, which Kaelin had gathered from the leeward base of a dune, while Leo drove the walking stick into the sand at an angle to check wind direction. The fire that resulted was small enough to cover with both hands, and it produced more heat than light, which was the correct priority. Light carried. Heat stayed local. Kaelin had arranged the stones around it in a configuration that told him she had made camp in open desert before. Many times, in conditions where being seen was a problem. Leo sat with his knees pulled up and his back against his pack, and let the warmth work on his fingers. The temperature had dropped fast after sundown, not gradually the way it dropped in the city, but all at once, as though the desert had simply decided to be done with warmth for the day. His hands had gone stiff within 20 minutes of stopping, the joints pulling tight, the fine motor coordination that he depended on for close work becoming clumsy and unreliable. He picked up Kaelin's brass breastplate and the polishing cloth. She had set the plate down when she removed it for the night. The desert cold made metal armor a liability after dark, pulling heat directly from the body, and it was sitting propped against her pack with its surface filmed in a day's worth of fine grit. Leo shook the cloth out and began working on the nearest section. Small circular motions, the way he cleaned a lens. The grit came off in pale streaks. Beneath it the brass was still good, still solid, scratched in the particular pattern of a plate that had stopped things it was not designed to stop. His fingers slipped twice on the cloth. He adjusted his grip and kept going. Kaelin watched him from across the fire. She was sitting with her legs crossed and her bad arm rested in her lap, and she had been watching him since he picked up the plate with an expression that was not quite suspicious and not quite curious, and occupied the exact territory between the two. He did not look up. He moved to the next section, working around the strap fittings where the grit collected in the joints. "Why?" she said. He looked up. Then she had not inflected it as a question. Exactly. It sat in the air between them like a stone placed on a table, not thrown, just set down with deliberate weight. He looked back at the breastplate. "The grit gets into the fittings," he said. "If it works into the buckle mechanism, it will bind when you need it to move." She was quiet for a moment. "That is not what I asked," she said. He polished the strap fitting and moved to the next one. His fingers were still stiff, but the heat from the fire was helping, the joints loosening incrementally. "You are asking why a scholar is in the Dune Sea with an infected soldier," he said. "Yes," she said. He considered the question the way he considered a damaged text, looking for the part that was actually being asked, beneath the part that was said. She was not asking about his motivation in the abstract sense. She was asking why he had not left her on the library floor and sent for a physician and gone back to his desk. She was asking why he had chosen the inconvenient option. "I had the map," he said. "You needed someone who could read it." She did not respond immediately. The fire shifted, a stalk collapsing into coals, and the light changed. "Vanguard navigators can read maps," she said. He glanced up. "Vanguard navigators don't have the specific map you needed," he said, "and they would have had to get clearance to enter the Dune Sea, which would have taken longer than you have." He set the breastplate down and examined the surface. Most of the grit was gone. He worked on a remaining patch near the lower edge. "So it was practical," she said. The word landed flat, like she was testing it for weight. "Yes," he said. She looked at the fire. He looked at his hands, which had steadied somewhat. He thought about adding something, about the treatise, about the fact that he had recognized the curse markings before he recognized anything else about her, about the way an archivist accumulates debts to knowledge that occasionally require paying in inconvenient ways. He decided against it. She was not asking for an explanation. She was asking for a reason she could place somewhere inside her own framework, and practical was a reason that translated. He finished the breastplate and set it carefully against her pack. He wrapped the cloth around his hands and held them near the fire, watching the last of the stiffness ease out of the knuckles. The desert pressed in around the small circle of warmth. Above them, the stars were extraordinary. No city haze, no lamplight, just the full count of them laid out in every direction, so many that the dark between them seemed incidental. Kaelin reached into her own pack with her good hand and produced a strip of dried meat, which she broke into 2 pieces without looking at him, and set the larger piece on the sand between them. He picked it up. The meat was dense and oversalted and required significant effort, which he suspected was deliberate. Trail rations designed to make you drink, because hydration was the variable that killed people in the desert before anything more dramatic got the chance. He chewed and looked at the stars and did not say anything for a while. "The Vanguard," he said eventually, "operates past the eastern boundary." "How far past?" She did not answer immediately. He heard her shift her weight, heard the quiet sound from her arm that he had been tracking all day, the soft pour of it that never quite stopped. "Far enough," she said. "The things that come out of the deep desert don't stop at the boundary because someone drew a line on a map." He thought about the survey's fauna appendix. He thought about what the military had classified as acceptable attrition. "The wraith," he said. "How close did you have to be?" Another pause. "Close enough that it could choose me specifically," she said. He understood that this was all she intended to say about it. He unwrapped his hands from the cloth and flexed his fingers once better, functional, the fine motor work returning. He checked the compass bearing by the stars out of habit, confirmed it was holding, and put the compass away. He pulled his jacket tighter against the cold, settling in at his back, and looked at the small fire, which had burned down to coals now, still radiating. Still enough. Across from him, Kaelin sat with her bad arm in her lap, and her eyes on the dark beyond the firelight, watching the desert the way a soldier watches a perimeter. She had not stopped watching it since they sat down. He thought about pointing out that she could sleep, that he would take first watch. He thought about how that offer would land, coming from him, and decided to let her reach that conclusion in her own time. He tucked his chin to his chest, closed his eyes, and listened to the desert. He woke to her hand on his shoulder. Not a shake, just contact, steady and brief, the way you'd wake someone you didn't want to startle. He surfaced fast, the way light sleepers do, and found the fire reduced to a faint orange trace in the coals, and the desert dark and cold around them. The stars had moved. He had slept longer than he intended. He pushed his glasses up and looked at Kaelin, who had withdrawn her hand, and was sitting very still across the dead fire. She was not looking at the perimeter. She was looking at her own chest. He sat up fully. The cold hit his back, where the jacket had shifted during sleep. He waited, reading her posture the way he read damaged text, looking for what was present, not what he expected to find. Her good hand was pressed flat against her sternum over the brass plate, except the brass plate was off. She had removed it at some point in the night and set it beside her pack, and her hand was pressed against the rough-spun undershirt beneath. She was not moving. She was breathing in the careful, measured way of someone who has found something and is deciding what to do with the finding. "It moved," she said. He was already reaching for the tinderbox. He sparked it once and held the small flame between them, which gave him perhaps a meter of useful light. She watched him cross the distance between them and crouch beside her. He could see her jaw was set. Not with pain, or not only with pain, with the particular tension of someone who has trained themselves not to show vulnerability and is currently in a situation that makes that training inadequate. "Show me," he said. A long pause. The flame wavered. She reached for the hem of her undershirt with her good hand and pulled it aside at the collar, exposing her left shoulder and the upper chest. In the tinderbox light, he brought his face close and looked. The curse had crossed onto her chest. The sand pattern branched from the shoulder inward, following the lines of something beneath the skin, not veins exactly, but whatever pathways the wraith infection used to navigate living tissue. The border where the curse met healthy skin was raised in a specific texture, a hardened ridge he recognized from the forearm. From here he could see it had a pattern, not random branching, something with structure. The tinderbox burned his fingers. He closed it. The dark returned, complete. He sat in it for a moment, thinking. He could not read the pattern with his eyes at this distance in this light, which was to say he could not read it at all. But he had worked for 6 years in an archive where 3 of the reading lamps were permanently out of oil, and the budget for replacements was a recurring administrative negotiation. And in that time he had developed the habit of using his fingertips on raised text when the light failed. Embossed seals, wax impressions, the scored lines of formal documents. His fingers were calibrated for texture in a way his eyes, even corrected, were not. "I need to read it by touch," he said. "The pattern. It will tell me how far the progression has reached the chest wall and which direction it's moving." He kept his voice level, the same tone he used when explaining a research methodology. He heard her breathe. He heard the desert, which was silent in the way only open, empty places are silent, not absence of sound, but the sound of absence. "All right," she said. She took his hands. She did it deliberately, reached out and found his wrists in the dark and lifted his hands and guided them to her chest. The gesture was precise, without hesitation, which told him she had decided before she woke him. She had been sitting with the decision in the dark for some time before she chose it. She placed his fingertips at the origin point of the curse mark, just below the collarbone, and held them there for a moment, then withdrew her hand. He worked slowly. The texture under his fingers was exactly wrong in the way he had feared. The raised border of the curse had the quality of something crystalline embedded just beneath the skin, sharp-edged, irregular. It scraped faintly against the pads of his fingertips as he traced it, like running a finger along a page of text pressed into glass. He moved with the same care he used on fragile parchment. He could feel where the pattern branched. He could feel the heat differential between the living skin and the cursed skin. The infected area was slightly cooler, which matched the treatise's description of the wraith withdrawing warmth as it progressed. He traced the full extent of it, collarbone to sternum, a branch toward the center, a longer branch angling down toward the lower ribs. He measured the spread against his handspan, which he knew precisely, 18 centimeters from thumb to little finger. The infection covered roughly 2 handspans of chest. He tracked the leading edge of the longest branch and felt where the texture thinned, where the curse was still establishing itself in new tissue. That told him the direction of travel. He sat back. "It's moving toward the center," he said. "The longest branch is heading for the sternum. Once it crosses that, it will have access to both sides." He heard her exhale, not sharply, just a controlled release, the kind that carries information. "How long?" she said. Not a question with a question mark, a question that expected a number. "At this rate," he said, 2 days. "Perhaps less." He paused. "We need to move faster tomorrow." She said nothing to this. He found the tinderbox again and sparked it, and in the brief light he caught her expression, not afraid, not resigned, but recalibrated, the look of someone adjusting a tactical assessment. She reached for her undershirt and pulled it straight. She picked up the breastplate and held it in her lap without putting it on. The flame died. In the dark, she said, "The vanguard has a right," and then stopped. He waited. "When a soldier is too far gone to continue," she said, "they are given a choice. Complete the mission or return for ceremony." Another pause. "I was given the choice 4 days ago." He absorbed this. "And you chose the mission," he said. "I chose the oasis," she said. "The mission is already done. There is no one left to report to." He sat with that for a moment. Then he rebuilt the fire from the coals, carefully, feeding it small pieces of scrub until it caught. He did not ask about the mission. He did not ask about the others. He set a canteen near the heat to take the overnight chill off the water, because cold water in the morning burned calories the body needed for warmth, which was a fact from the same military survey that had given him the route. Small facts, applied consistently. It was the only kind of help he knew how to offer that she would accept, without having to decide whether to accept it. She put the breastplate back on. He listened to the buckle click into place in the dark and watched the fire find its level and did not sleep again for a long time. The stars gave him the correction at 3 hours before dawn. He had been lying on his back with the astrolabe held above his face, squinting through the sighting arm at a star cluster the survey called the Shepherd's Hook, a formation of 7 stars used by the pre-imperial desert traders to navigate the deep dune sea in the period before the military had mapped it and subsequently lost the maps. The survey had included a 2-paragraph note on the technique, which Leo had translated and retained because the geometry was elegant. The principle was simple enough. The shepherd's hook rotated around the fixed point of the northern axis at a known rate. Its position relative to the horizon told you both the hour and, if you knew your intended bearing, whether you had drifted from it. They had drifted. Not badly, perhaps 4 degrees east of their intended line. Correctable. He noted the adjustment on the edge of the survey scroll with the stub of a graphite pencil he kept in the satchel's inner pocket, and lay there for a moment longer, holding the astrolabe above his chest and looking at the stars through the scratched glass of his lenses. He had not slept again after the fire. He sat up, stowed the astrolabe, and looked across at Kaelin. She had settled into a position against her pack that was not quite sleeping and not quite waking. The light-managed rest of someone who had learned to recover without fully lowering their guard. Her bad arm was tucked against her side. Her good hand rested near the blade at her hip. She breathed with the slow evenness of someone doing it deliberately, parceling out the rest in controlled doses. He did not wake her. He rebuilt the fire once more from the last of the scrub, enough to heat the water in the canteen he had set aside, and used the warmth to eat and think. By the time the sky had shifted from black to the deep gray that preceded dawn, he had the route recalculated and the day's bearing committed to memory and 3 strips of dried meat distributed between 2 cloth squares, one larger than the other. He set the larger square beside her pack and waited. She woke with the first light, which was not really light yet, but a change in the quality of the dark, a reduction in the density of it, east-facing. She moved from rest to upright in one continuous motion, her hand already off the blade when she registered the fire and him and the arrangement of the morning. She looked at the cloth square beside her pack. She picked it up without comment and ate, looking east. They broke camp in the wordless efficiency of people who had now done it enough times to know the order of things. Coals buried, packs assembled, compass checked, bearing set. Leo's heel held without complaint under the repaired boot. The blister had not worsened overnight. He counted this as a meaningful victory and said nothing about it. The first shelf arrived mid-morning. The survey had described it as a hard basalt shelf running perpendicular to the dune ridges, exposed where centuries of wind had stripped the sand back to bedrock. From a distance, it looked like a dark line drawn across the desert floor, geometric and wrong in the context of all that shifting pale sand. Up close it was rough and fractured, the surface cracked into irregular plates that shifted slightly underfoot where the substrate beneath had eroded. It ran perhaps 200 meters across their path. Leo picked his way across it with the walking stick testing each plate before he committed his weight, and Kaelin crossed 2 meters to his left, picking her own line through the fractures. The survey's bearing correction happened here. He stopped at the far edge of the shelf, consulted the scroll, checked the compass, and turned them 11 degrees south. Ahead the dune crests were lower, and between them the ground was different. Harder, less loose, the sand compressed into a surface that held weight better. The deep desert, the part the military had stopped mapping. The heat peaked and broke, and the afternoon moved under it. Humidity hit him before he understood what it was. It arrived as a change in the air, a thickness, a faint organic smell that did not belong in a place where nothing grew. He stopped walking and stood still, turning his face into the light wind, and behind his lenses, his eyes registered a slight fogging at the lower edges of the glass. He took the glasses off and looked at them. The inside of the lenses had clouded faintly with condensation, moisture, subterranean moisture rising. He put the glasses back on and immediately had to wipe them with the cloth, which helped for approximately 30 seconds before they fogged again. He wiped them a second time. They fogged again. He put the cloth in his hand and kept it there, and alternated between wiping and squinting at the terrain ahead through the cleared lens, which gave him roughly half a useful field of vision at any given moment. Kaelin had stopped beside him. She was looking ahead and slightly down, and her posture had changed, the set of her shoulders, the angle of her chin. "There," she said. He wiped the glasses and looked. The dune crests dropped sharply ahead, descending into a wide crater that the surrounding ridges had hidden entirely until this angle. The bottom of the crater was below the level of the desert floor, sunk into the bedrock like something had pushed down on it from above centuries ago, and the land had never quite recovered. And in that sunken basin, catching the late afternoon light in a way that sand did not catch light, the oasis. The water was blue in the specific way that deep mineral water is blue, not the blue of sky reflected, but its own color, coming from beneath. It illuminated the crater walls faintly from below, giving the stone a faint luminescence that made the whole basin look like the inside of something that had not quite gone dark. Around the water's edge, low vegetation clung to the wet stone, pale adapted things, not green exactly, but alive, which was extraordinary given everything outside the crater rim. Leo stood at the crest and looked at it and thought about the military surveyor who had written 2 terse sentences about the curative properties of the water and moved on to the next entry. He wondered what the man had looked like standing at this same rim, whether he had stood here with the same particular feeling of having carried a theoretical thing across a very large distance and found it to be real. Kaelin made a sound beside him, not words. Something lower and shorter from the chest. He glanced at her. Her jaw was tight. Her good hand was pressed flat against her breastplate over the place where he had traced the curse mark in the dark, a gesture he suspected she was not aware of making. He moved first. He stepped over the crest and started down. The descent into the crater was steep, the sand loose enough that footing the slope required him to lean back and let gravity assist rather than fight it. He went sideways, walking stick braced, and slid the last 2 meters in a controlled drop that landed him at the crater floor with both boots and one palm in the sand. He wiped the glasses again. Kaelin came down behind him in 2 long strides, landing clean, and the momentum carried her 3 steps toward the water before she caught herself. She stopped. She stood with the water's edge perhaps 10 meters ahead of her and did not move, and Leo straightened and looked at her and understood. She had been carrying this destination for 4 days. The thing you carry that long develops a weight beyond its actual weight, and arriving at it requires a moment of adjustment. Time for the body to understand that the carrying is almost done. He let her have the moment. He was looking at the water, and the vegetation at its edge, and the crater walls rising around them, and the sky above the crater rim, which was beginning to shade toward evening when the temperature of the air changed. Not the natural drop of evening, something faster, something with intent. He looked up. The sky above the eastern rim had gone the color of old iron. The color spread fast. Not cloud built from the top down and had texture variation, the internal movement of weather. This was flat and uniform and moved as one thing, the way a wall moves, and it was coming from the east with a speed that made distance deceptive. Leo stood at the crater floor with his glasses already fogged and watched the eastern rim of the crater darken from iron to black, and felt the first grit hit his face. He turned to say something to Kaelin. She was already facing it. She had her shield off her back, and her feet set at shoulder width, which was a stance he had come to associate with her, deciding something was a threat worth formal acknowledgement. Her bad arm was raised slightly, the way it always was now, held away from her body as though she was protecting it, or protecting others from the sand that fell from it. She watched the eastern rim with no expression he could name, and he understood that she had seen something like this before. Not the same, not this specific horror, but the shape of it, the thing behind the weather. The sandstorm hit the crater rim and poured over it like water over a lip. The sound arrived first, a sustained low roar that had no gaps in it, no rhythm, just continuous pressure against the eardrums. Then the grit, fine enough to get through any gap, finding the collar of his jacket, the edges of his lenses, the inside of his mouth when he breathed wrong. Leo pulled his scarf up over his face and wiped his glasses with the cloth and looked for what was inside the storm. He saw it when the first lightning moved through the cloud. Not real lightning, no thunder followed, no ionized smell. The flash was dark, which was not a thing lightning was, but the shape it made in the storm cloud was the shape of something moving. A form too large and too deliberate to be weather. It rose from the storm's center, the way smoke rises from a fire connected to the base, drawing from it, using it, and where it moved the sand moved with it, directed rather than blown. The desert wraith, not a passive infection anymore. Tracking them. As the treatise had said, the primary entity would track an infected host when the host came close to a cure. Leo took 3 steps toward the crater wall. He needed to think, and he could not think with the wind hitting him directly. The crater wall gave a meter of shelter at the base, just enough to cut the force of it. He pressed his back to the stone and looked at the oasis. The water was still there, still luminescent, 10 meters from where Kalen stood, 10 meters. He looked at the wraith descending from the storm into the crater, and he looked at the water, and he ran the geometry. The wraith was between them and the pool. Kalen crossed to him in 4 strides, putting her back to the wall beside him. She had to lean down to speak near his ear over the roar. "The blade passes through it," she said. "I already know this." He had read that sentence in the treatise and not fully understood it until now. Watching the wraith's form shift and flow around itself, a body made of the same material it controlled, no fixed interior, nothing to cut. "I know," he said. "Don't use the blade." She looked at him sideways. "Then what?" she said. The grit hit his glasses again. He wiped them and they fogged immediately from the humidity rising off the oasis. He took them off entirely, which reduced his useful vision to shapes and light at arm's length, and tucked them into his jacket pocket. Without them, the wraith was a dark mass in a darker storm, enormous and imprecise. The crater walls were pale shapes. The water was a faint blue smear to his left. This was, he acknowledged privately, a significant problem. He pressed his palms against the crater wall behind him, feeling the stone. Ancient stone. The crater was old. The survey had estimated pre-imperial based on the mineral composition of the walls, which meant whoever had built anything here had built it before the current calendar, before the current kingdoms, before the military that had eventually found and classified and lost the location. Pre-imperial desert cultures had used sunlight as a working material. The survey had mentioned that in the same paragraph as the curative water, the way a surveyor noted 2 facts in the same location without connecting them. Leo had connected them. He had connected them in the library and not thought about them again, because finding the oasis had been the immediate problem, and the wraith had been a theoretical subsequent problem, and now the subsequent problem was 30 meters away and descending. He needed the ruins. "There are ruins here," he said. Kalen looked at him. The wind was loud enough that he had to raise his voice, which he did not like doing. The people who built this place used focused light as a tool. There will be optical instruments in the ruins, or the remains of them. He looked along the crater wall to his left, where the vegetation thickened slightly, which usually indicated structure, old walls holding moisture. "That direction," he said. "I need you to get me there." She did not ask why. She grabbed his arm just below the shoulder with her good hand and moved. She did not pull him. She positioned herself half a step ahead and to his left, blocking the worst of the wind and the grit, and moved at a pace he could match. He kept his free hand on the crater wall for orientation, feeling the stone change under his fingers, basalt. Then something worked. Then the edge of a cut block that had no business being that regular. Old construction, he felt along it, and turned the corner, and the wind dropped sharply. A wall. Still standing, most of it. Maybe 2 meters of worked stone remaining above grade, forming a partial enclosure on 3 sides. The 4th side was open to the crater floor. Inside the enclosure, the wind was a sound rather than a force, and Leo could breathe through his scarf without grit working past the cloth. He crouched and ran his hands across the floor of the enclosure, which was stone, and felt debris, sand compacted into corners, small rubble, the crumbled remains of things that had once had specific shapes. He cut his palm on the first sharp edge. He felt it as pressure first, then the slow warmth of blood tracking across his palm, and he moved his hand more carefully after that. Slower, feeling each shape before pressing into it. Rubble. More rubble. A fragment that might have been ceramic. A curved surface he thought was a bowl until it proved too thick and too smooth and resolved when he ran his thumb along the edge into a lens ground from crystal. Cracked across the center, too small. He kept looking. Behind him, outside the enclosure, he could hear Kalen's shield absorbing something. A repeated impact, not the sharp crack of the glass spiders, but a low, forceful thud, the sound of something hitting iron and transferring all its force into the arm behind it. She was not striking back. She was holding position, absorbing, keeping the wraith's attention off the enclosure. He heard her grunt once with the force of a blow that moved her feet in the sand. He moved faster. His bleeding hand found a flat surface, wide. Smooth in a way that was not natural stone, worked smooth, polished smooth, the kind of smooth that had a purpose. He pressed both palms against it and felt the edges, a slab too large to lift, not what he needed. He felt around the base of it, and his fingers found a fragment that had broken off, roughly triangular, one face polished, the other raw crystal. And when he lifted it, the weight was wrong for its size in the way that dense mineral material was always wrong for its size. Quartz. A shard of the focusing apparatus, broken off and buried in the drift of centuries. He closed both hands around it, blood and all, and stood up. Kalen was bleeding. He could not see it clearly without his glasses. The world past arm's reach was shapes and inference, but he could see enough. The dark smear at her temple. The way she held her shield arm slightly lower than before, a centimeter of compensation that meant the shoulder behind it had taken something it was still processing. She stood at the enclosure's open side with her feet dug into the crater floor and her shield up, and the wraith moved around her in the particular way that things without fixed form move, not circling exactly, but redistributing, finding new angles, testing the edges of her defense. The storm roared above the crater rim and poured itself over continuously, feeding the wraith's body with fresh material. Every time Kalen drove it back with the shield, it simply absorbed the force and reformed on the other side. Patient and vast and entirely indifferent to the physical effort it cost her to keep redirecting it. Leo watched this from the enclosure entrance. The crystal shard held against his chest. The wraith struck. It came in low and fast, a compressed mass of sand and cold moving faster than weather had any right to move, and it hit Kalen's chest before the shield could track it. The impact had no blade in it. Nothing to cut, just force. The accumulated mass of a sandstorm directed into a single point. She went back 2 steps, 3, her boots dragging furrows in the crater floor. Her left hand came up instinctively to brace against the shield's back face, and Leo saw her jaw lock against whatever that cost her. The curse mark on her chest, the blow had landed exactly there. She steadied. She brought the shield back up. Her left hand dropped back to her side, and she looked at it once, briefly, with the expression of a soldier conducting a rapid damage assessment. Her fingers on the bad arm had gone gray to the second knuckle. The impact had accelerated the progression. He could see it even without his glasses, the color wrong in a way that registered even at this distance. She closed the hand slowly, opened it, and returned her attention to the wraith. "Physical steel cannot cut the wind," she said, to herself as much as to him. Her voice was level, which cost something. She took 1 step forward, reclaiming the ground she had lost, and drove the shield edge forward into the wraith's reforming mass. The iron passed through it cleanly, no resistance. The way iron passes through smoke. She pulled back and reset. Leo looked at the quartz shard in his hands. He looked at the sky above the crater rim, which was entirely obscured by the storm. No direct sunlight, the storm had eaten it. The wraith had timed this, or the storm had built to this, or both. The natural logic of a creature that controlled sand and was weakened by light choosing to fight in a manufactured dark. He turned the shard over in his hands and felt the polished face and thought about the geometry of light and how a focusing lens worked and what you needed for it to work, which was a source. Direct sunlight was gone. He thought about the water. The oasis glowed from below. Subterranean minerals, the survey had said. Bioluminescent, possibly, or piezoelectric, or something the pre-imperial builders had seeded into the aquifer for exactly the purposes they had then built optical instruments to use. It was not sunlight. It was a different spectrum entirely, colder and more diffuse. He did not know if it would be sufficient. He did not have enough information to calculate the probability with confidence. He was going to try it anyway. "Kaelin," he said. She did not look at him. "I hear you," she said. "I need the wraith between me and the water," he said. She was quiet for 2 seconds, which was the length of time it took her to run the geometry herself. "How close to the water?" she said. "As close as you can get it," he said. Another 2 seconds. "When?" she said. "Now," he said. "While I cross to the other side." She hit the wraith with the shield face. Not an edge strike, a full drive forward with her body weight behind it, using the iron surface as a door to push rather than a blade to cut. The wraith absorbed the force and moved backward, exactly as it had been moving her backward all this time, redistributing away from pressure. She followed it, driving again, pushing it 1 step at a time toward the water's edge. Leo moved. He went left, around the enclosure wall, keeping low and close to the crater floor. Without his glasses, the ground was a pale surface with no detail, and he navigated by feel and memory the wall on his right, the curve of the crater floor dropping slightly toward the water, the change in temperature as the oasis humidity thickened the air around him. He moved as fast as he could move without making noise that would redirect the wraith's attention, which was faster than he would have chosen in daylight, with full vision on even ground. His boot found a loose stone and he went down on one knee. He caught himself with the hand that was not holding the crystal, which put his scraped palm flat on the crater floor, and he pushed back up without stopping. His knee throbbed. He kept moving. The luminescence of the water was visible now even without his glasses. A faint blue wash on the stone around the pool's edge, enough to navigate by if he did not need to navigate precisely. He reached the far side of the pool and turned. The wraith was between him and the water, exactly where he needed it. Kaelin stood behind it with her shield up, still driving, keeping the pressure on so it could not redistribute toward him. Her silhouette was dark against the storm, enormous and determined and running on something beyond ordinary endurance. The wraith's form rose between them, 3 meters of compressed sand and cold malevolence, blocking the glow of the pool entirely from his angle. He needed the light to pass through it. Wraiths were not solid. This was the property that made them impossible to stab and ought to make them possible to illuminate. They held their form through magical coherence, not physical density. Light should pass through. The question was whether the mineral luminescence of the oasis water was strong enough, focused enough to matter. He held the quartz shard up and angled it toward the pool's glow. The polished face caught the blue light and threw it forward in a weak, diffuse wash. Not enough. He adjusted the angle, trying to focus the refraction, and the wash narrowed slightly, but remained pale and uncertain. He needed more surface. He needed the shard closer to the water. He went down to his knees at the pool's edge and held the polished face directly over the luminescent water. And the light that bounced back up through the crystal was stronger, concentrated by proximity. He aimed it at the wraith's center mass. The beam that emerged was not impressive. It was narrow and cold-colored, and not the blinding lance of focused sunlight he had imagined in the library when he first connected the surveyor's 2 sentences. It was enough to be visible. It caught the wraith's interior, and the wraith's interior did something in response, a contraction, a tightening of the coherence that held its form together. Not weakened, not shattered, but affected. Kaelin saw it. She lowered the shield 1/2 meter and looked at the wraith's reaction, and looked at him across the pool, and her expression, which he could not fully read without his glasses, did something that was not quite hope and was not quite relief, but was adjacent to both. Then she looked up. Above the crater's eastern rim, where the storm had swallowed the sky, there was a line, thin, precise, the specific pale color of early light hitting the underside of cloud cover. The storm had not yet reached the western horizon. The sun had not yet fully set. There was a gap, narrow as a blade, between the storm's lower edge and the desert floor to the east. She pointed at it and looked at him. He looked at the gap. He looked at the crystal in his hands. He looked at the angle between the gap and the wraith's position and the polished face of the shard and felt the geometry of it assemble in his mind with the same clean inevitability as a translation clicking into sense. Not the oasis light, sunrise. He just had to survive until morning. The wraith decided it had been patient long enough. It turned from Kaelin and came for him. He saw it as a shift in the blue light on the pool's surface. The glow occluded, the temperature dropping 2 degrees in the span of a breath, the sound of the storm suddenly closer and more deliberate. He scrambled backward from the water's edge on his hands and knees, and the wraith passed over the spot where he had been kneeling, and the pool's surface frosted at the contact, a thin skin of ice forming and cracking immediately in the mineral warm water beneath. Leo got to his feet and moved. He had no direction except away, which was not a plan, but was a start. His boots found the crater floor, and he ran with his free hand out in front of him, navigating by the wall he knew was somewhere to his left. The wraith moved behind him with the sound of a sustained exhale, not fast exactly, but constant. And constantness in a pursuer was its own kind of fast because it did not tire and did not slow, and did not make the small errors that physical fatigue produced. Kaelin hit it from the side. She drove the shield into its mass with a full-body strike that interrupted its trajectory and bought Leo 4 seconds of uncontested ground. He used them. He found the crater wall with his outstretched hand and turned left along it, back toward the enclosure ruins, back toward the place where the stone was worked and the floor was something other than loose sand. His knee from the earlier fall was sending a steady complaint upward, but the complaint was manageable and he managed it. Behind him, he heard the wraith reform. He heard Kaelin reposition. He heard her take another blow. This one she did not absorb cleanly. He heard her boots drag, heard the involuntary sound she made, short and bitten off, the kind of sound that escapes past a soldier's discipline when the force is simply more than the discipline can account for. He did not stop moving. Stopping would make the last 4 days a waste, which was not something he was prepared to allow. He reached the enclosure and went in. He dropped immediately to his knees and pressed both hands to the floor, moving fast now, not careful because careful required time he did not have. His bleeding palm left marks on the stone he could not see. He swept his hands across the floor in broad arcs covering ground and found the large flat slab he had located before, and the base of it, and the area around the base. He needed more quartz, larger pieces. The shard he had was functional but insufficient. It could catch the oasis light and diffuse it, but the gap in the storm that Kaelin had pointed to was the actual solution, and for that he needed a focusing surface large enough to matter. The pre-imperial apparatus had been built for this. The ruins were the apparatus. The pieces were here. He found a curved fragment near the slab's right edge. Ceramic, not crystal. He dropped it. He found another piece, smaller than his palm, that had the right weight and ran his thumb across its face. Rough, unpolished. He dropped it. He moved left and swept the corner, and his fingers found 3 things in quick succession. Rubble, rubble. And a piece that was flat on one face and curved on the other and dense in a way that stopped his hand mid-sweep. He picked it up and pressed his thumb hard across the flat face. Smooth. Ground smooth. Polished smooth. He held it in both hands and felt the edges, roughly trapezoidal, about the span of his 2 hands side by side. Thicker at one end than the other, which indicated a deliberate grind. This was not a fragment of a flat plate, but a piece of a shaped optical instrument, designed to converge light toward a focal point. Exactly what a sun priest would use to direct focused solar energy through a crystal medium. His hands were shaking, not from fear. His arms had been holding the smaller shard extended for several minutes before he ran, and the muscles were registering their objection now that the adrenaline had simplified the list of immediate priorities. He pressed the larger piece against his chest to stabilize it and breathed. Outside the enclosure, the storm was constant, and Kaelin was somewhere in it, and he needed to move. He took his glasses from his jacket pocket. He put them on and immediately regretted it. The grit scratched across both lenses in the wind, and the fogging from the oasis humidity returned within seconds, and what he could see through the combination of scratches and condensation was approximately half of what he could see when he had removed them. But half was better than the blur he was navigating without them, and what he needed to do next required him to see the sky. He stood up, tucked the larger piece under his bad arm, held the smaller shard in his good hand, and walked back to the enclosure's open side. The wraith had Kaelin against the far crater wall. He processed this in pieces because the scratched lenses and the storm made processing it all at once impossible. She was upright. That was the first thing, and it mattered. Her shield was up. The wraith pressed against it with the slow, sustained force of something that understood leverage, that understood that it did not need to strike fast if it simply never stopped pushing. Her boots had dug channels in the crater floor behind her. The wall was at her back. She had perhaps a meter of space between the wall and the wraith's leading edge, and she was filling that meter with the shield, and everything behind the shield, and whatever was left in her after 2 days of desert and 4 days of the curse and this. The dark hand of the curse had spread to her neck, He could see it even through the scratched lenses, the discoloration tracking up from the collarbone, the texture of it visible where the skin was exposed above the breastplate's edge. He looked east. The gap was still there, thinner now. The storm was closing it from both sides, the wraith directing the sand to seal its own vulnerability. But the eastern horizon was lighter than it had been, the sky behind the storm shifting toward that specific dark blue that preceded the sun by 30 minutes. The storm would close the gap entirely in less than that. He looked at the angle between the gap and the crater floor, and the position of the wraith, and felt the geometry again. The same clean assembly. He needed to be on the crater rim. He needed to be at the eastern rim specifically, where the gap was lowest to the horizon, where the first direct rays would clear the storm's edge. He needed to be there with both pieces of optical apparatus held at the correct angle before the gap closed, and he needed Kalen to keep the wraith exactly where it was. He crossed the crater floor at a run. He passed close enough to the wraith that the temperature of it hit him, a cold that had nothing seasonal about it, the cold of something that had not been warm in centuries. He did not slow. He hit the eastern crater wall and looked up. It was steep, the same loose sand he had descended on arrival, but the walls had exposed stone in places where the sand had blown clear, and stone had edges, and edges were handholds. He tucked the larger piece inside his jacket against his chest, and jammed the jacket closed with his free hand, and began to climb. He had not climbed anything in a serious sense since he was perhaps 12 years old, and the thing he had climbed then had been a garden wall in much more favorable conditions. The crater wall was 3 meters of steep sand and exposed rock, and he went up it on his hands and knees with the walking stick abandoned at the base and the crystal shard in his right fist and his left hand finding whatever the stone offered. His knee screamed, his palms scraped. The larger piece shifted inside his jacket, and he pressed his elbow against it to hold it, and kept moving. He pulled himself over the crater rim and stood up into the full force of the storm. The wind hit him like a door swung hard. He staggered 1 step, 2, and drove his feet into the sand and bent into it and stayed up. The grit hit his lenses and hit his face and hit every exposed surface, and he could not see more than 3 meters in any direction. He turned east and kept his eyes down and moved forward until the ground began to drop slightly, the rim's outer edge, and then he stopped. He reached into his jacket and pulled out the larger piece. He held both pieces up and faced east and waited for the sun. The gap was closing. He could see it even through the scratched lenses, the storm's lower edge pressing down from the north and south simultaneously, the 2 walls of it moving toward each other with the slow, grinding patience of something that did not need to hurry. The eastern horizon below the gap was the color of banked coals, deep red shifting toward orange at the very base. The sun was behind the desert floor, but rising. He could feel it the way you feel a fire in an adjacent room. Not warmth yet, but the promise of warmth, a change in the quality of the air that preceded the actual heat. He had perhaps 20 minutes. He stood at the outer edge of the crater rim with the storm at his back, and both pieces of optical apparatus held in front of him, and tried to calculate the angle. The problem was that he could not see the sun directly. It had not yet cleared the horizon. He was calculating for a light source that did not yet exist at the position he needed it to occupy, which meant he was working from the arc, the known rate of the sun's apparent movement across the sky, the angle of the horizon relative to his position, the distance from the rim to the oasis floor below, and the position of the wraith as he had last seen it before climbing. He had none of these figures precisely. He had estimates derived from the compass bearing, the astrolabe readings from the previous night, the survey's notation of the crater's dimensions, and his own body as a measuring instrument, his height, his arm length, the span of his hands. It was not enough to be certain. It was enough to try. He extended his arms fully and held the larger piece, the shaped optical fragment, the pre-imperial focusing instrument, at what he calculated was the correct elevation. The smaller shard he held behind it, angled to catch whatever the larger piece directed. The position required him to hold both arms extended and slightly raised, and his muscles registered this immediately. The larger piece alone was manageable. Both together, held steady, held at a precise angle, held for 20 minutes. His arms had already been working all night, and they told him clearly what they thought of this plan. He held them up anyway. The wind drove grit against his lenses in continuous waves, and he could not wipe them, both hands occupied, and so he squinted through the accumulated scratches and condensation and watched the gap and waited. His shoulders began to burn at the 5-minute mark. He shifted his weight and kept the elevation. At the 10-minute mark, his triceps had progressed from burning to a deep structural fatigue that was no longer really pain, but a wholesale loss of confidence in the muscles themselves, their basic conviction that they could continue to do this. He locked his elbows and transferred the load to bone rather than muscle, which helped for approximately 2 minutes before the angle drifted, and he had to correct it, which required muscle again. The gap was half the width it had been when he reached the rim. He looked down into the crater. He could see the wraith's mass from here, a dark compression against the far wall, the blue of the oasis water barely visible beyond it. Kaelin was a shape he could not resolve clearly through the lenses. She was still there. She had not gone down. He took that as data and held the crystal. Lure it to the pillar, he said to himself, to the wind, to the geometry of the problem. There was a broken column in the enclosure ruins. He had felt it when he was searching the floor, a cylinder of worked stone that had fallen and cracked along its length. If Kaelin could draw the wraith to that position, it would put the creature directly in the path of the angle he was calculating. He needed to tell her this. He filled his lungs and screamed into the wind. The storm took his voice and shredded it within 2 meters. But he had aimed it downward at the crater floor, and he had screamed as loud as his body permitted, which was not very loud but was everything available. "The broken pillar," he screamed. "Get it to the broken pillar." Left of the enclosure. He did not know if she heard him. He watched the dark shape that was Kaelin and the dark mass that was the wraith and waited. She moved, deliberately, away from the wall and to the left, drawing the wraith's attention and the wraith's pressure after her, step by step across the crater floor. The wraith followed. It would always follow, the infected host, the source of its investment, moving toward the cure it intended to prevent. She led it across the floor with the shield up and her pace measured, not running, not giving it a reason to accelerate, just moving with the controlled deliberateness of someone who knew exactly what they were doing and trusted the person on the rim. She stopped at the broken pillar. Leo looked at the horizon. The sun cleared it at that moment, not dramatically, not with any visual ceremony, just the leading edge of the disk appearing below the storm's base, the first direct light in 2 days, cutting flat and hard across the desert floor from the east. It hit the outer face of the larger crystal piece, and the piece caught it, and Leo felt the warmth of it on his hands for the first time, and the geometry snapped into focus in his mind with absolute clarity. He adjusted the angle 3 degrees down, 2 degrees left. The focused beam emerged from the smaller shard's face and dropped into the crater below. It hit the wraith directly. The effect was not the same as the oasis light. This was direct solar energy, focused through pre-imperial optical apparatus designed for precisely this application. And what it did to the wraith's form was structural. The sand composing its body did not scatter. It fused. The magical coherence that held the form together interacted with the focused light, and the interaction produced heat, and heat in concentrated sand produced glass. He watched from the rim as the wraith's mass began to solidify from the point of contact outward, the shifting, flowing form hardening into something fixed and dark, a process that moved through its body like water freezing, not instant, not uniform, but irreversible. The crystal was burning his hands. The focused energy that passed through it deposited heat into everything it touched, including the hands holding it, and his palms had taken more damage tonight than they had in 32 years of careful archival work. He felt it as a deep, pressing heat that bypassed the nerve ending's ability to process it as ordinary pain and registered instead as a simple, clear signal. This is doing damage. He gritted his teeth and did not drop it. The wraith was not yet fully solidified. The gap was still open. He held the crystal and held the angle and let the sun do what it was made to do. His arms dropped 2 centimeters. He caught it, corrected, held. His jaw was tight enough to ache. He looked down at the crater floor and watched the wraith's form lose its fluidity. Section by section, the shadow mass becoming something with edges, something that occupied space in the fixed way that objects occupied space, rather than the flowing way that the wraith had moved all night. It was nearly glass. It needed one more thing. He screamed again into the wind, all the air he had. Now Kaelin, the shield. Now she heard him. He saw it in the way she moved, not a reaction to his voice exactly, but a confirmation of something she had already been building toward. The way a held breath releases when the moment finally arrives. She had been watching the wraith solidify from 2 meters away, with her shield gripped in both hands, bad arm and good. And when his voice came down from the rim, she was already in motion. She drove forward with everything, not a strike, a charge. She covered the 2 meters in one stride, and hit the wraith's solidifying mass with the full face of the shield and every kilogram of body weight behind it. And the sound that produced was not the dull thud of iron on sand, but something harder and higher, the specific resonance of force meeting a thing that had become brittle. The wraith's form cracked along the lines where the focused light had already done its work, the fused sections fracturing at their weakest joints, and for 1 second the shape of it was visible clearly, the full extent of the thing that had been tracking them for 4 days, enormous and cold, and now finally fixed in place. Then Kaelin swung. She stepped back half a pace and brought the shield around in a horizontal arc that used her full reach, and the iron edge connected with the wraith's center mass at the point where the solidification was deepest, and the crack lines ran in 3 directions simultaneously. The impact traveled through the structure, the way impact travels through glass, finding the flaws, following them, multiplying them. The wraith's form held for precisely 1 second after the blow landed. Then it came apart, not dramatically, not with any sound commensurate with 4 days of desert, and everything that had led to them standing in this crater at sunrise. It simply fractured along every line the focused light had scored into it, and the pieces fell. Dark glass fragments hitting the crater floor in a cascade that lasted perhaps 3 seconds and then stopped. The storm above continued for a moment, carrying its own momentum, and then that too began to lose coherence, the directed quality of it, the intent behind the wind, dissipating into ordinary weather, and ordinary weather in the deep desert at dawn was simply a stiff breeze from the east. The grit stopped driving. Leo stood at the rim with both arms still extended and the crystal still held at the calculation's angle, and felt the sun on his hands and did not move for a moment. The beam that had done the work now fell onto empty crater floor and scattered harmlessly. He became aware. in the specific order that the body allows awareness when the emergency has passed, of several things: the burning in his palms, the structural failure of his arms, the state of his knee, and the fact that he was standing on the outer edge of a crater rim in a desert at dawn with no walking stick and no clear memory of having made a plan for getting back down. He lowered his arms. The larger crystal piece slipped from his left hand, and he grabbed it against his chest with his elbow and held it there. His right hand still gripped the smaller shard. Both palms were wrong in a way he was not ready to examine closely. He turned carefully on the rim, found the inner edge, and looked down into the crater. Kaylin stood at the center of the broken glass field. She was not moving. She stood with the shield at her side, its face turned toward the ground, and she was looking at the fragments around her feet, the way you look at something you need to verify is finished. Her bad arm hung lower than it had been hanging. Her neck, he could see even from the rim, even through the scratched lenses, was dark to the jaw on the left side, the curse having made its final advance in the night. How much of that was the wraith's blow to her chest, and how much was simply time, he could not calculate. The oasis was behind her, still glowing undisturbed. He put the smaller shard inside his jacket with the larger piece and found the crater wall with his hands and started down. The descent was faster than the ascent and involved less technique and more controlled falling. He went down the steep section sideways with his hands dragging against the stone for friction, hit the sand below at an angle, and absorbed the impact with his good knee. He straightened and crossed the crater floor. She turned when she heard him coming. He stopped at the edge of the glass field, 2 meters from her, and looked at her properly for the first time since the storm had hit. Really looked with the lenses he had just wiped on the inside of his jacket, the clearest view he had managed in hours. She was standing under her own power, both eyes open, tracking, present. The blood from her temple had dried to a dark line that ran to her jaw. Her shield arm had dropped to a resting position rather than a guard position, which told him the shoulder had been assessed and found functional. Her bad arm she held out slightly from her body, and he looked at it. The sand had stopped falling from it. He blinked and looked again, bringing his face closer. The crumbling edge that had been advancing all this time, the border where the curse consumed living tissue, was still not healed. Not reversed, but stopped the way a fire stops when the fuel runs out. Whatever the wraith had been feeding into the infection had died with the wraith, and the progression had halted where it was, which meant the arm from elbow to fingertips was still dead sand, which meant the oasis still mattered. He looked at her face. She had been watching him examine the arm with an expression that was completely still in the way that controlled expressions are still, held deliberately, nothing permitted to move in case movement revealed something he understood. She had been looking at that arm for 4 days. She already knew what he was seeing. "It stopped," he said. "Yes," she said. "The oasis will reverse it," he said. "That is what the water does." That is what the survey described and what the pre-imperial builders designed this place to do. He was aware that he was explaining something she had crossed a desert to reach, and that the explanation was therefore unnecessary. He did it anyway. She let him. She looked at the water behind her, then back at him. Her gaze dropped to his hands, which he had been holding slightly away from his sides in the instinctive way of hands that have been burned. She looked at them for a long moment without speaking. He looked at them too. The palms were red and blistered in a pattern that mapped exactly the surface area the crystal had occupied, and the blisters were already full, and the skin around them was tight. They were not the worst burns he had seen described in the archive's medical documents. They were the worst burns he had personally experienced, which was a different category. "Can you walk?" she said. "Yes," he said. She reached out with her good hand and took one of his wrists. Carefully, the way he had taken her arm in the library 4 days ago. Not gripping, just holding. She turned his hand palm up and looked at the damage, and her jaw did something brief and controlled. Then she turned and walked toward the water, still holding his wrist, and he followed. The crater floor was quiet. The storm had reduced to wind, and the wind was just wind. Above the eastern rim, the sun had fully cleared the horizon, and its light fell into the crater at a low angle, hitting the surface of the oasis and bouncing upward in long patterns across the stone walls. The blue mineral light and the gold morning light layering together into something that had no ordinary equivalent. They walked to the water's edge and stopped. She released his wrist. She stood at the edge and looked at the oasis, and he stood beside her, and neither of them said anything for a moment. The water was still and clear close to the surface, the glow coming from deeper down, from whatever the aquifer carried that made it what it was. The pre-imperial builders had found this place and built around it, and eventually left, and the military had found it and mapped it and eventually lost the map. And now they were here, the two of them, at the end of 4 days of desert, and the water was still doing what it had always done. She stepped in. She went in without ceremony, still in the breastplate, still with the blade at her hip, and the water rose around her boots and her shins and her knees, and at the point where it reached her waist, she stopped and stood still and held her bad arm submerged to the shoulder. Leo sat down on the flat stone at the water's edge, put his burned palms face up on his knees, and watched the sun climb the eastern wall of the crater. The water worked slowly. He had expected something immediate. The documents he had read described curative waters in the language of miracles, which was the language available to writers who did not understand the mechanism. The oasis did not work like a miracle. It worked like a process. He watched it from the bank and understood that what he was seeing was biological reversal, the mineral content of the water interacting with the curse's structure at a cellular level, undoing in minutes what the wraith had spent days constructing. It started at the fingertips. The color returned there first, not all at once, but in patches. The gray sand texture softening at the edges, the dead surface rehydrating into something that moved again when she flexed her fingers. She flexed them slowly, testing each one in sequence, and he watched her face while she did it. She was looking at the hand with the focused attention of someone reading a document in a language they had been told they would never read again. Her jaw was still set. Her expression did not change. The reversal tracked up the hand to the wrist. He looked at his own hands on his knees, palms up, blistered and tight. The morning air was cool enough that the burns did not actively sting unless he moved his fingers, which he was therefore not moving. He was aware that he needed to clean and dress them properly before the blisters broke on their own, which would happen eventually regardless of his preference. He was also aware that the medical cloth and canteens were in the satchel, which was on the far side of the oasis where Kalen had set it down before the wraith materialized, and that retrieving it would require standing up and walking around the pool, which he was not currently prepared to do. He watched the water work instead. The reversal reached her forearm. She turned the arm slowly in the water, checking the underside, and he saw the moment the border crossed the point he had mapped with his fingertips 2 nights ago in the dark by the campfire. She stopped turning. She held the arm still and looked at where the border had been, and for a moment her breathing changed. Not dramatically, just a slight irregularity in the rhythm of it. One breath that was not quite the same length as the others. Then the rhythm steadied. A bird moved somewhere above the crater rim. He heard it without seeing it. A dry, ascending call, one note repeated, the kind of desert bird that started moving at first light and did not stop until the heat drove it back to whatever shade it found. He had not heard a bird in 4 days. The reversal climbed to her elbow. She waded slightly deeper, bringing the waterline up to her shoulder, submerging the curse mark on her chest without taking off the breastplate. He thought about the mark as he had read it. 2 handspans of branching crystalline texture, the leading edge reaching for the sternum. She stood in the water with her arm at her side and her eyes closed, and he looked at the exposed skin above the breastplate's edge where the curse had tracked up her neck. That reversed last. He watched the discoloration fade from her jaw downward, the texture smoothing, the color of living skin returning in a slow tide. Her neck, her collarbone, the edge of what was visible above the brass plate. When it was done, he could see no border remaining, only her skin, green and whole, with the older marks that had always been there, the scars that predated any wraith, the record of a decade of the vanguard's work. She opened her eyes. She looked at her arm for a long time. Then she looked at the far wall of the crater, at the morning light moving down it in a slow, bright sheet. She did not say anything. He did not say anything. Some things did not require commentary, and he had learned in 32 years of working with documents that silence around an important thing was more respectful than filling the silence with words that were not adequate to it. She waited out. She came out of the water with both arms at her sides, moving with the same deliberate economy she always moved with, and the water ran off the brass plate and off her boots and darkened the stone at the pool's edge. She stopped in front of him and looked down at his hands, and he looked up at her, and she lowered herself to one knee so their eye lines were closer to level. She reached into the satchel without looking away from him, found the medical cloth by touch, and took it out. She found the canteen and uncorked it. She worked with her restored hand, the left one, the one that had been sand and was now whole, and she worked carefully with the same steadiness she had used when she dressed his heel on the second day. She dampened the cloth and cleaned around the first blister without breaking it, working the grit out of the surrounding skin, and he sat with his palms up and watched her hands. She had a scar on the back of her left hand. He had not been able to see it before. It ran from the knuckle of her first finger to the wrist in a line that was too straight to be accidental. The kind of scar that a blade makes when it is held still rather than swung. He did not ask about it. It was not the kind of scar that invited questions. It was the kind that had answers already given to the person who needed to give them. She cut 2 squares of cloth and placed them over the worst of the blistering, pressing lightly to seat them, and bound them in place with a longer strip tied at the wrist. She did the same for the other hand. Her movements were unhurried. When she finished, she did not immediately stand. She stayed kneeling with his bandaged hands between hers and looked at them for a moment with her head slightly down. "At the library," she said. He waited. "You touched the arm to read the curse." She said it as a statement, not a question, but it had a question inside it. "Yes," he said. She looked up. "You already knew what it was," she said. "You recognized it." He considered the precise accuracy of this. "I had read a description of it," he said. "In a document I translated 6 years ago, 1 paragraph." She studied his face with the focused attention she used when she was deciding whether something was true. "And you read the document and remembered the paragraph?" She said. "Yes," he said. "Everything I have read, I remember," he said. "It is not a skill. It is simply how I am built." She sat with this for a moment. Then she stood, collected the canteen and the remaining cloth, and packed them back into the satchel. She picked the satchel up and slung it across her chest. She extended her left hand, the restored one, the one that had been sand 40 minutes ago, and waited. He put his bandaged hand in hers, and she pulled him to his feet in one smooth motion, absorbing his weight without adjusting her stance. He found his footing on the stone, and she released his hand and stepped back, and picked up her shield from where it had lain since the fight. Examining the face briefly, running her thumb along a new dent in the iron surface, and then slinging it across her back. He retrieved his walking stick from where he had dropped it at the base of the crater wall. He checked the compass from habit, noted the bearing home, and tucked it away. The satchel was on her back. His stick was in his hand. The crater floor was quiet around them, the glass fragments of the wraith already beginning to disappear under a thin drift of wind-blown sand, the desert practicing its usual patience with the evidence of what had happened. He turned toward the crater wall and the climb out. She moved to the wall first and turned back to look at him. She studied the wall and studied him with the same measuring look, calculating angles and capacities the way she had been calculating them since the library, and then she simply put her back to the wall and laced her fingers together and waited. He looked at the offered handhold. He looked at her. She looked back at him with an expression that had no charity in it, and no condescension, and no particular emotion he could name, just the plain practical assessment of a problem and a solution. He stepped into her hands, and she lifted him to the first good handhold, and he climbed the rest of the way to the rim, and then he reached the top and turned and looked down at her, and she went up the wall in 4 moves. The way people go up walls when climbing is simply a thing they have always known how to do. They stood together on the crater rim. The desert spread in every direction, pale and enormous, already warming in the early sun. Behind them the crater held the oasis, still glowing faintly even in the daylight, a blue pulse in the stone. Ahead of them the dune crests ran northwest toward the city. He checked the compass one more time, set the bearing, and walked. She walked beside him, not behind, as she had walked on the way out beside, at the same pace, the satchel on her back and the shield on her back, and both arms moving freely at her sides. They walked for 2 days. The return was not easier than the journey out. The dunes did not rearrange themselves for people heading home, and the sun did not moderate itself for people who had already paid what felt like a sufficient toll. But it was different. The weight that had driven them into the desert in the first place was gone, and absence of weight was not the same as lightness, but it was something. The compass bearing held. The dunes passed beneath them, one at a time. Kaelin carried the satchel both days without discussion. On the first evening she gathered the scrub for the fire without being asked, and Leo set the stones in the configuration she had taught him by example on the first night out, and they sat on opposite sides of the small heat and ate the last of the dried meat in silence. His bandaged hands made the eating awkward, and she did not comment on this. He managed. His knee had stiffened badly on the climb out of the crater and had loosened again across the afternoon's walking, and by evening it was merely sore rather than limiting, which he counted as progress. She slept that night. Actually slept, not the managed half-rest of the outward journey, but the real kind. Her breathing slow and deep, her good hand open on the sand rather than positioned near the blade. He took the watch himself. He sat with the compass in his bandaged hands and checked the stars and listened to the desert and let her sleep. In the morning she looked at him across the rebuilt fire with an expression he had learned to read as the equivalent of a question she had not yet decided to ask. He waited. She drank from the canteen and handed it across. He drank. "You watched all night," she said. Not an accusation, not quite a question. "Yes," he said. She looked at the fire. "You should have woken me," she said. "You needed the sleep more than I did," he said. She considered this with the expression of someone who has been given an answer that is accurate, and also not the point. She did not say anything else about it. They broke camp and walked. The first shelf appeared at midday on the second day, the dark basalt line running across their path exactly where the compass said it would be. and Leo stepped onto the first cracked plate and felt something ease in his chest that he had not been aware was tight. Known ground, confirmed position. The survey's route holding to within the margin of error he had calculated at the start. He crossed the shelf with his stick testing each plate and did not try to hide the small satisfaction of it. Kalen crossed 2 meters to his left and said, "You are pleased with yourself," which was not phrased as a compliment, but was also not phrased as a criticism. It was phrased as an observation made by someone who had been watching him for 4 days and was now accurately reading the data. "The route held," he said. "I calculated the bearing with instruments that were not designed for this terrain, and the route held." She stepped over a fractured plate. "Vanguard navigators use the same stars," she said. "Vanguard navigators had accurate maps," he said. "I had 1 military survey and a compass with a cracked crystal." She was quiet for a moment. "It held," she said. "Yes," he said. They came off the shelf onto the compressed sand of the near desert, and the walking became easier. And in the late afternoon the city appeared on the horizon as a dark line that gradually resolved into walls and towers, and the particular density of a place where many people had decided to be in the same location. Leo stopped at the top of the last dune crest and looked at it through his scratched lenses, and thought about the reading room and the scattered pages of the dropped tome and the sand on the library floor. Kalen stopped beside him. She was looking at the city, too, with an expression he could not fully interpret. Not reluctance, not relief. Something more complicated than either. The city had a garrison. The garrison had records. The vanguard had protocols for soldiers who came back from operations where others had not, and those protocols were not known for their gentleness. He did not know what waited for her in that city and understood that this was not his calculation to make. "The library window," he said. She looked at him. "I will tell the building superintendent that a large piece of decorative stonework fell from the upper arcade and struck it," he said. "It is a plausible explanation. The arcade stonework has needed repair for 11 years. She looked at him for a moment, then looked back at the city. "And the stolen map," she said. "I borrowed it for a survey project," he said. "I returned it this morning." He paused. "It is filed under pre-imperial cartography, restricted access. No one will look at it." She made a sound that was not quite a laugh, too short, too dry, emerging from somewhere that did not often produce sounds like it. It lasted perhaps 2 seconds, and then it was done. They came down off the dune and walked the last kilometer on hardening ground as the sun fell behind the city wall and the air cooled. The quarry road found them before they found it, the packed dirt appearing under their feet with the mild surprise of a familiar thing encountered after a long absence. Leo put his walking stick on the road and listened to it tap on solid ground instead of sinking into sand, and felt the difference in his hands and his knee and his spine, all of which had opinions about the return to firm footing. The eastern gate was lit from inside, the lamp above it casting a warm circle on the road. The same guard, or a different one, Leo could not tell at this distance. It did not matter. He straightened his jacket with his bandaged hands, checked that the compass was in his pocket, and walked up to the gate with the same plain expression he used when returning from the quarry at an unremarkable hour. The guard looked at him. The guard looked at Kalen. The guard looked at the state of both of them. The scratched lenses, the bandaged hands, the dented shield, the general condition of 2 people who had been somewhere that disagreed with them, and made the calculation that this was above his pay grade to investigate. The bar lifted. The gate swung in. They walked through. The city sounds closed around them, voices, a cart on stone, the smell of cook fires and river water, and the accumulated scent of a place where life was conducted indoors. Leo stopped just inside the gate and stood still for a moment, letting his eyes adjust to the lamplight after 2 days of open sky. Kalen stopped beside him. He looked up at her. She was looking at the street ahead, at the lamplight on the stone, at the city receiving them back without ceremony or acknowledgement, the way cities receive everyone. Her left hand, the restored one, hung at her side. She flexed the fingers once, the way she had flexed them in the water when the feeling came back, testing the reality of them. He had translated a paragraph 6 years ago about a place he had never expected to find. He had kept that paragraph in his memory alongside everything else he had read, filed under unusual cartography, and he had not thought about it again until a window broke and a woman was dying on his floor, and the paragraph was suddenly the most useful thing he owned. He thought about this without finding a satisfactory way to frame it. Some knowledge waited years before it became necessary. Some knowledge stayed theoretical forever. You could not know in advance which was which, so you kept all of it, and you kept your glasses polished and your compass wound, and when the window broke you crossed the room. He tucked the compass into his pocket. "The infirmary," he said, "is 2 streets north of here. They will treat the burns without asking many questions if I present the request correctly." He paused. "After that I intend to find something hot to eat." Kalen looked down at him. She looked at his bandaged hands, and at his face, and at the scratched lenses through which he was looking back at her. "The infirmary first," she said. It was not phrased as a suggestion. They walked north together through the lamplit street, and the city moved around them and paid them no attention. And the night came in quietly from the east, from the direction of the desert, carrying a little sand the way it always did. It settled on everything equally, the way sand does, and was still.